My name is Rebecca Thompson and I'm from Portland, Maine. Last October, when my grandfather passed away, I inherited something I never, ever should have. I'd always known he owned property in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, but it was a place I'd never visited. He wasn't one to talk much about his past or our family history. So when he died at 93, leaving me his entire estate, the remote cabin, a place that had been in our family for over a century, felt like a complete mystery. My grandfather, Samuel Thompson, was born and raised in those West Virginia mountains before moving north in the 1950s. He almost never spoke about his childhood or why he'd left. Whenever anyone in the family would ask about his early life, he'd either change the subject entirely or offer vague answers about finding better opportunities up north. The few times I ever tried to press him for details, his eyes would grow distant, and he'd simply say some places were better left in the past. The lawyer handling his estate told me the cabin sat on a sprawling 47 acres of heavily forested land in a hollow they called Serpent's Gap, roughly 30 miles from the nearest town. There was no electricity, no running water, and the only access was a dirt road that became completely impassable after heavy rain or snow. Property taxes were laughably minimal, and the lawyer mentioned the cabin hadn't seen maintenance in decades, suggesting I might just sell the land to a timber company and try to forget about it. But something about this mysterious piece of family history intrigued me deeply. I was between jobs at the time, having just finished a contract with an environmental consulting firm. So I decided to drive down to West Virginia to see what my grandfather had truly left me. Maybe I could restore the cabin and use it as a quiet retreat, or perhaps I'd find it utterly worthless and sell it off. Either way, I felt a compelling need to explore this part of my family's story that my grandfather had kept hidden for so many years. The drive from Maine to West Virginia stretched over 2 days. I spent a restless night in a motel in Beckley, then headed out toward Serpent's Gap early the next morning. The lawyer's directions led me deeper into what felt like the heart of coal country, past small towns that seemed abandoned decades ago, empty storefronts, boarded-up houses, and the occasional solitary figure on a porch watching my car with wary, guarded eyes. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely wide enough for my Honda Civic. Tree branches scraped against both sides of the car as I carefully wound my way into the mountains, following a narrow creek that grew more overgrown with each mile. After about 40 minutes of cautious driving, I finally caught my first glimpse of the cabin through the thick canopy of trees. My initial impression was a pleasant surprise. The place seemed to be in much better condition than I had anticipated. It was a classic log cabin, likely built in the early 1900s, complete with a sturdy stone chimney and a covered front porch. The roof looked solid, and while the logs had weathered to a deep, dark gray, the overall structure appeared sound. Someone, I realized, had clearly maintained this place more recently than the lawyer had suggested. I parked my car next to the cabin and began to explore the property. There was an old well with a still-working hand pump, an outhouse that looked more modern than the main cabin, and several smaller outbuildings probably used for storage. The forest pressed in closely on all sides, towering oaks and maples blocking most of the sunlight. Even in the middle of the day, the hollow felt dim, enclosed, and strangely quiet. The front door was unlocked, which surprised me at first, until I remembered we were likely 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Inside, the cabin was furnished with simple, handmade pieces that seemed to be from the 1940s or 50s. There was a large stone fireplace, a small kitchen area devoid of modern appliances, 2 bedrooms, and a main living space with shelves overflowing with books and what looked like very personal belongings. That's when the truth truly dawned on me. My grandfather hadn't abandoned this place at all. He had been returning here regularly, likely for decades. The cabin wasn't merely maintained, it was used. There were recent additions like a battery-powered radio, canned goods with expiration dates from only a few years prior, and clothes hanging in one of the bedroom closets that I recognized as his. This wasn't just a property, it had been his secret retreat, a place he'd visited faithfully without ever breathing a word about it to any of us. I spent that first day exploring the cabin and sifting through my grandfather's possessions. Most of it was fairly unremarkable. Old hunting and fishing magazines, basic camping supplies, a few changes of clothes. But in the bedroom that was clearly his, tucked neatly under the bed, I discovered a wooden chest containing something far more captivating, more unsettling. The chest was filled with faded old photographs, letters, and what appeared to be journal entries dating back to the 1940s. The photographs showed my grandfather as a young man, often alongside other unfamiliar faces, all posed in front of various locations around the mountain property. There were snapshots of hunting trips, family gatherings, and what looked like community events or celebrations. But as I began to review the photographs chronologically, a deeply disturbing pattern emerged. In the earlier pictures, there were always 8 or 9 people in the group shots. Yet, as the years progressed, fewer and fewer individuals appeared, until by the 1950s, my grandfather was almost always alone in the frames. Where had everyone else gone? The journal entries began to offer some answers, but they raised even more troubling questions. My grandfather had been meticulously documenting something he called the feeding schedule. Early entries from the 1940s spoke of taking turns with other family members, ensuring someone visited the hungry place at least once a month during the warm seasons. He wrote about leaving offerings of fresh meat, usually deer or rabbit, at a specific location he referred to chillingly as the mouth. As I read further, a cold dread began to settle over me. I started to understand that my grandfather and his extended family had been caretakers for something truly ancient and living in the mountains surrounding the cabin. Something that required regular sustenance to keep it content and, more importantly, to prevent it from venturing into the valleys where other people resided. The journal entries described this entity as primordial, something that had existed in these mountains long before white settlers arrived, something the Cherokee tribes had known about and respected. According to my grandfather's notes, his family had forged an agreement with this entity generations ago. In exchange for keeping it fed and hidden, it would protect their land and family from harmful outsiders. But the agreement, he warned, came with strict rules and dire consequences for anyone who dared to break them. The journal entries from the late 1940s detailed, with a heartbreaking matter-of-factness, what happened when his cousin Robert attempted to leave the mountain and move to Charleston without fulfilling his assigned feeding duties. Robert vanished completely en route, his car found a week later, utterly destroyed, with no trace of Robert himself. My grandfather wrote that they all knew what had happened, but there was nothing they could do except continue honoring their obligations. One by one, family members had either died or mysteriously disappeared, until my grandfather was the sole individual left to maintain the feeding schedule. The later journal entries revealed his increasing desperation as he aged, realizing he might not be able to sustain his duties for much longer. He had tried to locate other family members who could take over, but most of his relatives had moved far away from the mountains and wanted no part of what they perceived as backward superstitions. The final journal entry was dated just 3 months before my grandfather died. He wrote in a shaky hand that he was too old and sick to make the monthly trips to the feeding place, and that he could sense the thing in the mountains growing, restless and hungry. He feared deeply what might transpire if no one continued the feedings after his passing. It was then I understood that he had decided to bequeath the property to me, his only granddaughter, desperately hoping I might grasp the gravity of upholding this terrifying family obligation. At the very bottom of the chest, wrapped carefully in an old piece of canvas, I discovered a crude but precise hand-drawn map indicating the exact location of the mouth and detailed instructions for acceptable offerings. According to my grandfather's notes, the feeding place was a natural cave opening about 2 miles up the mountain from the cabin, cunningly concealed within a grove of dead trees where, chillingly, nothing would grow. I sat there in that dimly lit cabin, the lamplight flickering over my grandfather's journals, trying desperately to comprehend the enormity of my discovery. Part of me, the rational part, wanted to dismiss the entire affair as the superstitious ramblings of an isolated mountain family, a product of a simpler, more fearful time. But another, colder part couldn't ignore the undeniable fact that my grandfather had maintained these bizarre rituals for over 60 years, long after he had moved away and built a completely new, modern life in Maine. He had never spoken of it to anyone, yet he had never stopped returning, year after year, to feed whatever resided in these mountains. As the sun finally set on my first day at the cabin, plunging the hollow into deepening shadows. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Fear. Tonight, prepare yourselves, because I'm bringing you a chilling collection of the most unsettling true horror stories ever to emerge from the ancient, whispering depths of the Appalachian Mountains. In this episode, we're not just scratching the surface. We're delving deep into the very heart of America's oldest mountain range, with 8 spine-tingling accounts of terror, tales that have been whispered through these hollows and shrouded peaks for generations. Each narrative you're about to hear is drawn directly from the harrowing, real-life experiences of survivors who ventured into these mist-shrouded landscapes and confronted horrors that defy all rational explanation. These aren't just mere campfire tales, folks, nor are they simply local legends meant to scare children. No, these are authentic accounts from real people, ordinary individuals who suddenly found themselves facing the unthinkable in the profound, unforgiving isolation of the Appalachian wilderness. You'll hear from hikers who realized, with a creeping dread, that they were being hunted by something far more sinister than any wild animal. You'll listen to explorers who unearthed deeply buried secrets in abandoned mine shafts, secrets that should have remained undisturbed. And you'll hear from travelers who learned firsthand, in the most terrifying way imaginable, why locals so fervently warn outsiders never, ever to stray from marked trails after dark. To safeguard the privacy and well-being of those brave enough to share their experiences, some names and specific locations have, of course, been altered. However, the terrifying visceral essence of each encounter remains utterly undiminished. These mountains have guarded their secrets for centuries, and tonight, you, my friends, will discover precisely why some places are truly meant to remain unexplored. If you're new here and crave the kind of content that seeps into your dreams and leaves you questioning what truly lurks in the shadows, then make sure to subscribe to Fear Files for daily true horror. And please hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment when the ancient darkness of these hills calls out to you. 3 summers ago, when I was 28, I had just completed my master's degree in environmental science at the University of Colorado. To celebrate, I decided on a solo hiking trip along the Appalachian Trail. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and I'm from Denver. I'd trekked plenty of demanding terrain back home in the Rockies, so I presumed the gentle rolling mountains of the East Coast would offer a relaxing change of pace. Little did I know, I couldn't have been more wrong about what truly awaited me in those ancient, deceptively serene hills. I began my hike in Virginia, aiming to cover about 50 miles over 5 days through the beautiful, iconic Blue Ridge Mountains. The first 2 days unfolded precisely as planned. The trail was clearly marked, the weather was ideal, and I was making good time, averaging about 12 miles daily. I'd stop to camp at designated sites, relishing the solitude and the quiet peace. The Appalachian wilderness possesses a distinct, almost palpable atmosphere compared to the Rockies. While Colorado's mountains feel raw, sharp, and majestic, these hills feel incredibly aged, heavy with history, and an undeniable watchfulness in the very air itself. Then on the 3rd morning, I awoke to find my GPS device completely dead. The battery had been full the previous night, and my backup power bank, though brand new, also inexplicably failed to work. I still had my trusty paper maps and compass, so I wasn't overly concerned. The trail was clearly marked with white blazes painted on trees every few hundred yards. What could possibly go wrong? I really should have known better. I'd been hiking for about 2 hours when I encountered him. I was taking a quick water break in a small clearing when this man emerged from the woods as if he'd been expecting me. He was likely in his 40s, dressed in faded camouflage pants and a torn flannel shirt. His long, greasy hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and he sported a thick, unkempt beard that looked untouched for months. But it was his eyes that truly caught me. A pale, washed-out blue, stark and unsettling, reminiscent of a winter sky. "You look lost, friend," he stated, even though I stood right beside a clear trail marker. I assured him I was fine, just resting, but he persisted. He introduced himself as Billy, claiming he'd lived in these mountains his entire life, knowing every trail, every hidden shortcut, every secret spring, and every cave. He spoke with a surface friendliness, a kind of forced warmth that felt deeply unsettling, like a smile that simply doesn't reach the eyes. Billy then proposed a much better route than the main trail, one that he promised would shave off about 8 miles and lead through some of the mountain's most pristine, untouched areas. He said most hikers never experience the real Appalachian wilderness because they confine themselves to crowded tourist paths. He could show me hidden waterfalls, ancient Native American sites, places where the mountain spirit still thrived. Every single instinct in my body screamed at me to refuse. This man, this stranger, appeared out of nowhere in thousands of acres of wilderness. Somehow knew I was alone, and was now offering to take me off the marked trail into areas where no one would ever find me if something went awry. Yet despite the alarm bells, he seemed genuinely eager to share his mountain knowledge. And I'd always prided myself on being adventurous, open to new experiences, maybe a little too much so. Looking back, what truly swayed me, what quieted those screaming instincts, was his intimate knowledge of the area. He could describe specific landmarks, name distant peaks I could clearly see, and even warned me about a section of the main trail that recent storms had apparently washed out. When I checked my map, everything he said was accurate. He was clearly a local, deeply familiar with these mountains, so, against my better judgment, I agreed to follow his shortcut. The initial hour of hiking with Billy was surprisingly pleasant. He led me off the main trail onto what looked like an old logging road, now mostly reclaimed by the forest. The path was faint but discernible, winding through dense stands of oak and maple. Billy was an excellent guide, pointing out edible plants, showing me fresh deer and bear tracks, and sharing fascinating stories about the area's history. He spoke of old mountain families who'd lived in these hollows for generations, their unique customs, and their deep-seated distrust of outsiders. He recounted tales of coal mines that had scarred these hills decades ago, some shafts so deep a dropped stone was never heard hitting bottom. And then, casually, he mentioned people still went missing in these mountains annually, mostly city folk who underestimated how easily one could get lost once off the marked paths. His words, delivered with a casual shrug, sent a shiver down my spine, though I tried to dismiss it. As we ventured deeper into the wilderness, however, unsettling details began to surface, slowly at first. We'd been walking for over 2 hours, yet we hadn't seen any of the landmarks Billy had promised. No hidden waterfalls, no ancient sites, just an endless, monotonous forest. When I inquired, Billy claimed we were taking a longer route due to recent landslides, a delay he hadn't mentioned earlier. Then it hit me. We weren't following any trail at all. Billy was simply guiding me through the thick woods, weaving between trees, ascending and descending ridges with no apparent destination or path. When I halted and asked to pinpoint our location on my paper map, Billy chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, saying maps were useless here, as the terrain constantly shifted with each storm. That's when I noticed we weren't alone. Initially, I thought it was just paranoia, mere glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, the snap of branches somewhere behind us. But as the afternoon wore on, I grew certain that at least 2 other individuals were shadowing us through the woods, staying just out of sight but mirroring our pace precisely. I confronted Billy, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly. The friendly mask evaporated, replaced by something cold and calculating in his pale eyes. He claimed his boys were just ensuring we encountered no trouble, stating these mountains could be perilous for those unfamiliar with them. When I asked what kind of trouble, he simply smiled, a chilling, empty expression, and remarked there were all sorts of predators in these woods, and some of them walk on 2 legs. At that moment, a cold certainty settled over me. I declared my immediate desire to return to the main trail. He laughed, a short, sharp bark, and asked if I even knew which way that was. I looked around, my heart sinking, realizing he was right. We had walked for hours through dense, unfamiliar forest, the sun now obscured by the thick canopy above. I had completely lost my bearings. Billy told me not to worry, that he and his boys would take good care of me. They had a pleasant camp nearby, he said, with hot food and cold beer. I could rest for the night, and in the morning, they would help me find my way back to civilization. The way he uttered, "help me find my way back," sent a profound, icy chill down my spine. I knew with absolute certainty that I was in grave danger. I was isolated in thousands of acres of wilderness with a man who had intentionally led me off any marked paths, and at least 2 others were lurking somewhere in the woods, waiting. My GPS was dead, my phone had no signal, and I had no idea which direction led to safety. I told Billy I needed to use the bathroom and stepped behind a large oak tree. The moment I was out of his sight, I bolted. My only plan, my only hope, was to create as much distance as possible between myself and whatever Billy and his cohorts intended. Running through dense forest is nothing like a trail run. Every step is precarious. Low-hanging branches lashed my face. Hidden roots tripped my feet, and visibility was limited to a few desperate yards. Behind me, I heard shouts and the unmistakable sounds of multiple people crashing through the underbrush. Billy was yelling my name, accusing me of being foolish, insisting I'd get lost and die without his help. His voice, distorted by distance and malice, echoed through the trees. I ran for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only 20 or 30 minutes. My lungs burned, my legs trembled with exhaustion, and thorns and branches had cut my arms and face. Finally, I had to stop, collapsing behind a fallen log, gasping for breath. That's when I heard the whistling. It wasn't a tune, not a melody, but a sharp, piercing sound, like a bird call, emanating from at least 3 different directions around me. Billy and his friends were communicating, coordinating their search. They knew these woods far better than I did, and they were hunting me like an animal. I forced myself onward, pushing past the pain and terror, aiming uphill. I remembered from my map that the main trail followed a ridge line. If I could ascend high enough, I might just spot a landmark to orient myself. As I climbed, the whistling grew fainter, yet I could still hear it, a chilling symphony of pursuit, echoing through the valleys below. These men weren't giving up. They would continue until they found me, and when they did, I had no doubt at all, that their intentions wouldn't end well for me. Just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, I reached the top of a ridge and beheld the most beautiful sight of my life. A familiar white blaze painted on a tree about 50 yards away. I had found the Appalachian Trail. I stumbled towards that trail marker as if it were salvation itself, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. Once back on the marked path, I resumed running, pushing my exhausted body, heading south, recalling a road crossing about 5 miles in that direction. I ran until complete darkness enveloped me, using my flashlight to follow the precious white blazes from tree to tree. I reached the road crossing around midnight and with shaky hands flagged down the first car I saw. The driver, a local sheriff's deputy, took one look at my torn clothes, my bleeding face, and my wide, terrified eyes, and immediately asked what had happened. I recounted the entire harrowing story, and his expression grew grimmer with each chilling detail. He informed me, his voice grave, that I wasn't the first hiker to report being lured off the trail by helpful locals in that particular area. There had been 3 missing persons cases in the past 2 years alone, all solo hikers who had simply vanished in that exact section of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The deputy suspected a group of men living off the grid in those woods were targeting vulnerable hikers, preying on their naivety and trust. However, he explained, the terrain was so rugged and the forest so vast that they had never been able to track them down. To this day, I never discovered what Billy and his friends had planned for me, and I frankly don't want to know. What I do know, what haunts my every thought, is that I came perilously close to becoming another missing person statistic in the Appalachian Mountains. I haven't hiked alone since that day, and I never will again. The mountains are undeniably beautiful, majestic even, but they conceal dangers that extend far beyond wild animals and merely getting lost. Sometimes, the most insidious and dangerous predators are those who offer to help you find your way. This story, like so many others we hear, serves as a stark reminder that true horror isn't always supernatural. Sometimes it wears a human face, hidden behind a false smile and a deceptive offer of assistance. The wilderness, especially the ancient, secluded corners of our world, can bring out the best in nature, but it can also reveal the darkest depths of humanity. It teaches us that vigilance isn't just for battling unseen forces. It's a vital tool when navigating the unpredictable landscape of human interaction. Marcus's ordeal highlights the chilling reality that some individuals thrive on the isolation these places provide, turning solitude into an opportunity for malice. It's a sobering thought that the most beautiful, untouched places can harbor the most chilling secrets, and that the warmth of human connection can quickly turn into a trap. So, the next time you venture out, remember Marcus. Remember the whistling in the woods. And always trust your instincts, even when they seem irrational. Because sometimes, the most dangerous path is the one less traveled, especially when someone else is leading you down it. Be careful out there, and until next time, stay safe and stay terrified. Let me be frank. 5 years ago, I was young, foolish, and chasing adventure like a moth to a flame. My name is Tyler Kowalski, originally from Chicago. I was just 21 then, wrapping up my junior year at Northwestern University studying journalism. I harbored this romantic, almost naive idea of unearthing authentic American stories in the kind of forgotten corners tourists never bothered to visit. So, that spring break, instead of joining my fraternity brothers in Cancun, I chose to embark on a solo road trip through rural Appalachia. My goal was to write about the genuine mountain culture that, I believed, still thrived in those remote, hidden hollows. I'd devoured articles about the moonshine tradition, supposedly still alive and well in the backwoods of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, even though it had been illegal for nearly a century. My quest wasn't for some sanitized tourist gimmick in a gift shop. I craved the real white lightning, the kind handcrafted by families who'd been distilling corn liquor since long before Prohibition. I genuinely believed that if I could gain access to that clandestine world and tell its story authentically, it would not only make a compelling piece for the campus newspaper, but might even catch the eye of some legitimate publications. My first week was spent meandering through tiny mountain towns, striking up conversations with locals in worn-out diners and dusty gas stations, desperate for any solid lead on traditional moonshiners. Most folks either feigned ignorance, their eyes just a bit too evasive, or they'd point me towards perfectly legal, utterly uninteresting tourist distilleries. But then, in a blink-and-you'll-miss-it town called Colton, West Virginia, I finally stumbled upon a real thread. I was nursing a lukewarm coffee and a plate of greasy eggs at a truck stop diner when I overheard two men at the next table. They were talking about someone named Old Pete, who was apparently having a nightmare with his latest batch. I caught snippets about the copper being off and needing to restart before the revenuers caught wind. As soon as they got up to leave, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and trepidation, I followed them out. I introduced myself, a wide-eyed college student researching Appalachian culture, eager to learn about traditional mountain crafts and customs. The older man, who introduced himself simply as Dale, fixed me with a shrewd, calculating gaze. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, weathered from a lifetime spent under open skies, his hands calloused and thick, and his clothes carried the unmistakable scent of tobacco and motor oil. After several minutes of intense, careful questioning about my precise interests and underlying motivations, he seemed to arrive at some internal conclusion about me. Dale then told me in no uncertain terms that if I was truly serious about understanding mountain culture, I absolutely had to see how things were still done the old way, by people who had upheld their grandfathers' methods without interruption. He spoke of a man named Pete Hartley, who ran a traditional operation tucked away in Bent Creek Hollow, about 30 miles further into the mountains. Dale gave me a stern warning. Pete was profoundly wary of outsiders and had no tolerance for unannounced strangers. However, if Dale himself vouched for me, Pete might be persuaded to show me around and perhaps answer a few questions. I agreed immediately, perhaps a little too eagerly, because Dale's response was a long, grave stare. He made it abundantly clear that I needed to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. What Pete was doing, traditional or not, remained profoundly illegal. He then added, with chilling quietness, that if I ever planned to write anything that could possibly draw law enforcement attention to Pete's operation, he would personally ensure I regretted it. His tone wasn't an overt threat, but the unspoken message was deafeningly clear. These mountain people fiercely protected their own, and any betrayal by a trusting city folk would not be forgiven. Dale instructed me to meet him the next morning at a gas station just outside Colton, and he would drive me to Pete's place. He also advised me to bring plenty of cash if I hoped to buy any samples, and more importantly, to be absolutely prepared to keep my mouth shut about anything I observed that wasn't directly related to the moonshine-making process itself. The next morning, I met Dale at the appointed gas station. He pulled up in a beat-up pickup truck that looked like it was held together by little more than duct tape and sheer willpower, yet its engine purred surprisingly smoothly and quietly. We ventured deeper into the mountains than I had ever dared, following a maze of increasingly narrow and rough roads that snaked through dense, ancient forest, past the skeletal remains of abandoned coal mines. After about 45 minutes, Dale abruptly veered onto what I initially mistook for a barely there hiking trail. It turned out to be a dirt track, barely wide enough for the truck, and we began to bounce and lurch violently up a steep mountainside, tree branches screeching and scraping against both sides of the vehicle. Dale explained, his voice low, that Pete's entire operation was nestled deep within these woods. deliberately far from any main roads, ensuring the telltale wisp of smoke from his still would never be spotted by anyone who might report it to the authorities. When we finally broke through the dense tree line and arrived at Pete's hidden compound, I was genuinely struck by the sheer elaborateness of the setup. Several ramshackle buildings were scattered around a natural, almost idyllic clearing, a traditional log cabin, a large shed that unmistakably housed the distillery, and a few smaller outbuildings for storage and equipment. The entire operation was a secret, meticulously concealed beneath the thick forest canopy, utterly invisible from above and reachable only by the treacherous, rough track we'd just endured. Pete Hartley himself materialized, looking exactly like the archetype of a traditional moonshiner I'd conjured in my mind. He was probably in his 60s with a long, unkempt gray beard and intensely suspicious eyes that seemed to instantly absorb every minute detail of my appearance and nervous demeanor. He wore faded overalls and a flannel shirt that had clearly seen better decades, carrying himself with the quiet, almost territorial confidence of a man utterly at ease in his own secluded domain. Dale introduced me simply as the college boy he'd mentioned, and Pete responded with a curt nod, devoid of any real enthusiasm. He grudgingly agreed to show me his operation and tolerate some questions, but he made it abundantly clear that my presence was solely because I was Dale's guest, and I shouldn't expect any special consideration just because I was scribbling notes for some school paper. Despite his cold reception, from a historical and cultural perspective, the moonshine operation itself was truly captivating. Pete utilized methods and equipment that had been meticulously passed down through his family for 4 generations. The still, in particular, was a true work of art, a gleaming sculpture of copper pipes and meticulously calibrated components that Pete had painstakingly constructed himself, drawing upon the ancestral knowledge his grandfather had imparted. He meticulously walked me through the entire complex process, from carefully selecting the right corn and ensuring proper fermentation, all the way to expertly managing the precise temperature and delicate timing of the distillation. Pete, despite his gruff exterior, was undeniably passionate about his craft, taking immense, almost fierce pride in producing what he confidently claimed was some of the finest white lightning in the entire region. He even allowed me to sample several different batches, patiently explaining the subtle flavor variations that arose from differences in ingredients and his refined techniques. The moonshine was incredibly potent, a fiery liquid far stronger than anything I'd ever dared to try, and I could feel its scorching path all the way down to my stomach. As the afternoon wore on, a steady stream of people began arriving at Pete's secluded compound. They pulled in on beat-up pickup trucks and noisy ATVs, navigating the same treacherous rough road Dale and I had used. Pete introduced them casually as customers and friends, local folks who had been buying his moonshine for years. They were friendly enough on the surface, but a chilling sense of unease settled over me. I sensed every single one of them was observing me with calculating eyes, trying to gauge if I could truly be trusted to keep their hidden secrets. That's when I made my first incredibly naive mistake. I had foolishly brought along a small digital camera, envisioning perfect shots for my article. I asked Pete if I could photograph some of his intricate equipment, perhaps even capture him in the act of working the still. Pete's refusal was immediate and definitive, but with the misguided confidence of youth, I pressed him, earnestly explaining how the pictures would genuinely help readers visualize and understand the traditional craft and culture I was meticulously documenting. Several of the other men exchanged quick, meaningful glances, and the atmosphere in the clearing instantly congealed, growing palpably tenser. Dale, his face etched with exasperation, pulled me sharply aside. He quietly, urgently explained that I had just asked Pete to willingly create incriminating evidence, proof that could be used to prosecute him and utterly shut down an operation that had sustained his family for nearly a century. He didn't suggest. He commanded me to put the camera away and never ever mention it again. Mortified, I profusely apologized, assuring everyone I deeply understood their concerns about photography. The palpable tension seemed to ease slightly, and we resumed our discussions about the history and traditions of moonshine production in the region. But a cold knot formed in my stomach. I knew instinctively that my foolish request for pictures had severely damaged the fragile trust Dale had worked so hard to establish on my behalf. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, The trickle of arrivals at the compound turned into a steady stream. My unease deepened as I noticed some of the newer arrivals were openly carrying weapons. Not just the hunting rifles one might expect in these parts, but prominent handguns and even what looked disturbingly like military-style firearms. The conversation, which had vaguely centered on distilling, began to subtly shift, drifting into hushed tones and coded language. I didn't fully comprehend the topics being discussed, but it became chillingly apparent that these conversations involved illegal activities extending far, far beyond simple liquor distillation. It was right then that I made my second and far more egregious mistake. Among the new faces was a man in his 30s who'd arrived on an ATV, a large, well-worn backpack strapped securely to his back. He immediately engaged in some hushed, urgent business with Pete, a transaction involving the exchange of sizable wads of cash for small, tightly wrapped packages that, even from a distance, definitely weren't moonshine. My journalistic curiosity, that foolish, insatiable beast, completely overwhelmed my self-preservation instincts. Against every fiber of caution, I started to overtly pay close attention, straining to discern every whispered word, every nuanced inflection of their intensely private conversation. The man with the backpack, his eyes sharp and dangerous, stepped closer and directly demanded to know what I had seen and heard since I arrived at the compound. I stammered, frantically trying to feign complete ignorance, claiming I had only been interested in the moonshine-making process and hadn't paid the slightest attention to anything else. But he wasn't fooled, not for a second. Nor were the other grim-faced men who now formed a tight, unyielding circle around me. Dale, his voice heavy with despair, tried one last time to vouch for me, pleading that I was just a naive college kid who had tragically stumbled into something far, far beyond my comprehension. But the damage I knew was irrevocably done. The man with the backpack, the chilling finality, declared that bringing an outsider to the compound during a business meeting constituted an unforgivable security breach, and there needed to be swift, decisive consequences to ensure such a lapse never, ever happened again. That's when my blood ran cold. They brought out a thick, coarse rope and a rusty metal chair. In that horrifying moment, a bone-deep certainty settled over me. I was about to become a brutal, unforgettable object lesson in what happens to people who see too much in these unforgiving mountains. Pete, watching the scene unfold, wore an expression of genuine, heartbreaking regret, but he made absolutely no move to intervene. Dale simply hung his head, shaking it slowly, and, in a voice barely above a whisper, reiterated his earlier warning. He had told me to keep my mouth shut about anything not directly related to moonshine. The next few hours blurred into a waking nightmare, the most terrifying ordeal of my entire life. But miraculously I survived. I walked out of those mountains, albeit shaken to my core, a different person. And no, I never wrote that idealistic article about traditional moonshine culture in the Appalachian Mountains. Some stories I've learned with a profound, bitter clarity are simply not worth telling, especially when the cost of telling them is far too high. The chilling memory of that day still occasionally creeps into my sleep, sometimes as vivid as if it happened yesterday. The feel of that rough rope, the metallic scent of the chair, the cold, hard glint in the backpack man's eyes, they are seared into my mind. I've since graduated, pursued a career in journalism, but my approach is fundamentally different now. The naive romantic zeal for authentic stories has been replaced by a healthy dose of caution and an acute awareness of the hidden dangers that lurk beneath seemingly innocent surfaces. I learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that not every secret wants to be uncovered, and not every story is yours to tell. Those mountains taught me a humility I desperately needed, stripping away my youthful arrogance and replacing it with a respect for boundaries and the unspoken rules of places that don't welcome outsiders. My pursuit of truth is now tempered by a profound understanding of consequences, a lesson etched forever into my very being by the unforgiving silence of Appalachia and the quiet threat of old Pete's regretful gaze. I lost 3 days of my life in those mountains, and even now, 2 years later, I only recall fragments of what actually transpired during that time. My name is Amanda Foster, and I'm originally from Phoenix, Arizona. What I'm about to share happened during what was supposed to be a straightforward solo weekend camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. As a software engineer, I consider myself a logical person who firmly believes in facts and evidence. But what occurred in those mountains defies every rational explanation I can conceive. At the time, I was going through a difficult divorce, and my therapist had actually suggested I try some solo activities to help rebuild my sense of independence and confidence. I'd always enjoyed hiking and camping, but I hadn't done much of it since my marriage began unraveling. So I decided to take a long weekend and drive all the way from Phoenix to Tennessee, seeking some time alone in the wilderness, exploring areas I had never visited before. I arrived at the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on a Thursday afternoon in late September. The fall colors were just beginning to emerge, painting the landscape in vibrant hues, and the weather was absolutely perfect for hiking and camping. I had reserved a backcountry campsite for 3 nights, planning to spend Friday, Saturday, and Sunday exploring some of the more remote trails before making the long drive back to Arizona on Monday. My campsite was quite secluded, located about 4 miles from the nearest trailhead, accessible only by hiking through dense forest along a narrow mountain path. I had been backpacking for years and was perfectly comfortable with isolation, but I had never camped quite this far from civilization before. The nearest other campers were at least 2 miles away, and during the day, I never saw another person on the trails. That Thursday evening, I set up my tent, cooked dinner on my little camp stove, and settled in for what I anticipated would be a peaceful night under the stars. I distinctly remember sitting by my campfire around 9 p.m., reading a book and truly enjoying the natural sounds of the forest around me. The last clear memory I have from that first night is checking my watch at precisely 9:47 p.m. and contemplating an early turn-in so I could get a head start hiking the next morning. The next thing I remember is waking up on Sunday afternoon in a completely different location. I was lying on bare ground in an eerie grove of dead trees, about half a mile from where my original campsite should have been. My tent, my backpack, and all my gear were nowhere to be found. I was wearing the same clothes I had put on Thursday morning, but they were filthy and torn in several places. My hiking boots were missing entirely, and my feet were cut and bruised, as if I had been walking over rough terrain barefoot for hours. When I finally checked my watch, it was 3:30 p.m. on Sunday. I had lost almost 3 complete days with absolutely no recollection of what had happened during that time. My mouth was parched. I was incredibly hungry and felt weak, as though I hadn't eaten or had much water in days. But the strangest thing was that I didn't feel like I had been unconscious or ill. I felt alert and aware, just utterly bewildered about where I was and how I had gotten there. I tried to retrace my steps back to my campsite, but nothing looked familiar. The grove of dead trees where I had awakened was unlike anything I had seen during my hike-in on Thursday. All the trees in the area appeared to have died recently. Their bark was black and peeling, and nothing grew on the forest floor beneath them. Even more disturbing, the trees seemed to have died in a perfect circle, with healthy, vibrant forest surrounding the dead zone on all sides. In the center of the grove, there was a natural depression in the ground that looked almost like a shallow crater. The soil there was dark and had an unsettling, oily texture that seemed profoundly unnatural. When I knelt to examine it more closely, I detected a chemical and unpleasant odor, like sulfur mixed with rotting vegetation. Carved into the largest of the dead trees were symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't letters or numbers, but complex geometric patterns deeply cut into the bark with some kind of sharp tool. The cuts looked incredibly fresh, and some were still oozing sap, despite the tree itself appearing to have been dead for months. I spent about an hour frantically searching the area for my camping gear, but I couldn't find any trace of my tent, backpack, or supplies. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Eventually, I gave up looking and tried to find my way back to the main trail so I could hike out to my car and try to figure out what in the world had happened. That proved far more difficult than I expected. I had hiked these mountains before and was usually proficient at navigation, but nothing looked right. The terrain seemed fundamentally different from what I remembered from my hike-in on Thursday. Hills and ridges that I was certain should have been in specific locations were nowhere to be found. Even the sun's position seemed wrong for the time of day and season. I wandered through the forest for several hours, growing increasingly desperate and confused. I should have easily found the main trail from where I was, but every direction I tried led me deeper and deeper into unfamiliar territory. It was as if the landscape itself had been subtly, terrifyingly transformed during the 3 days I couldn't remember. Just before sunset, I finally encountered another person. He was an elderly man wearing a park ranger uniform, walking alone on what appeared to be a game trail. When he saw me, he immediately asked if I was Amanda Foster and informed me that people had been searching for me since Friday morning when I failed to check in at the ranger station, as required for backcountry campers. The ranger, whose name was Bill Hriss, had been part of the search team combing the area for me since Friday afternoon. He said they had found my abandoned campsite on Saturday morning. My tent still set up, but there was no sign of me anywhere. There had been absolutely no evidence of a struggle or an animal attack. I had simply vanished without leaving any tracks or clues about my direction. Ranger Hriss radioed for assistance and then escorted me back to the ranger station, where I was questioned by park officials and local law enforcement about what had occurred during those missing 3 days. The problem was, I genuinely couldn't remember anything after sitting by my campfire Thursday evening. I had no explanation for how I ended up in the grove of dead trees, what happened to my camping gear, or why I had no memory of the intervening time. A medical examination at the local hospital revealed some truly disturbing findings. I had multiple small cuts and scrapes on my arms and legs that appeared to be several days old and partially healed. There were also what looked like injection sites on both of my arms, as if someone had been drawing blood or administering intravenous drugs. Blood tests came back clean for common drugs and toxins, but the doctor noted there were hundreds of substances that wouldn't show up in standard screening. Most disturbing, however, was the discovery of what appeared to be surgical scars on my scalp, cleverly hidden beneath my hair. They were small, maybe half an inch long each, and looked like they had been made with precise instruments. The doctor who examined them said they appeared to be recent, probably made within the past few days, but I had no memory of any medical procedures or injuries that would have required such treatment. Over the following weeks, I began to experience disturbing dreams that might actually have been recovered memories from those missing 3 days. In these dreams, I was lying on a cold metal table in some kind of underground facility, surrounded by people in medical scrubs who were conducting tests and procedures I couldn't fully comprehend. There were bright, blinding lights, the incessant hum of electronic equipment, and conversations and voices that seemed somehow not quite human. In one particularly vivid dream, I was conscious but utterly unable to move while someone examined my brain using equipment that looked far more advanced than anything I had ever seen in a regular medical facility. They were inserting thin probes through the small incisions in my scalp and monitoring my responses on screens displaying complex patterns and data. The most terrifying aspect of these dreams was the growing certainty that they weren't dreams at all, but actual, suppressed memories slowly returning despite efforts to keep them hidden. I began to recall being taken from my campsite by people who moved through the forest with unnatural silence and coordination. I remembered being transported through dark underground tunnels connecting different parts of the mountain and being held in a facility that was definitively not any legitimate research installation. I also began to remember other people brought to the same facility, other hikers and campers who had disappeared in the area over the years. Some of them had been there much longer than me, exhibiting chilling signs of repeated procedures and long-term imprisonment. I remembered being told I was being prepared for something, but I could never quite recall what that something was supposed to be. When I attempted to report these recovered memories to law enforcement, I was politely but firmly told there was no evidence of any underground facilities in the area, and that my experiences were likely the result of trauma-induced hallucinations or false memories. The official explanation for my disappearance was that I had simply become disoriented, wandered away from my campsite, and suffered a head injury that caused temporary amnesia. As a geologist, it's practically in my DNA to be drawn to the unknown, to delve into the Earth's secrets. So when I stumbled upon that peculiar mine entrance, curiosity wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was an irresistible pull. My name is Dr. Patricia Williams, and I hail from the bustling city of Boston, Massachusetts. But what I ultimately unearthed within those forgotten mine shafts, tucked away in the rugged mountains of eastern Kentucky, has seared itself into my memory, a chilling tableau that I know will haunt me until my dying breath. I had been conducting a geological survey for a mining company, one that was considering the audacious idea of reopening some of the old coal extraction sites, left derelict since the 1970s. My mission was straightforward: assess the structural integrity of the existing tunnels and determine if they could be safely expanded for modern operations. I had already spent 3 weeks immersed in the area, meticulously mapping and photographing dozens of abandoned mine entrances scattered across the rugged terrain. Most were exactly what you'd expect from old coal mines: dark, partially collapsed tunnels that extended perhaps a few hundred feet into the mountainside before becoming too dangerous or unstable to explore further. But this particular mine was different. It caught my attention the moment I first laid eyes on it. Its entrance was considerably larger than any of the others I'd surveyed, and it showed undeniable signs of recent activity, far more recent than should have been possible for a mine supposedly abandoned for nearly 50 years. There were fresh tire tracks in the dirt leading right up to the opening, and someone had clearly taken the time to clear away vegetation and debris that would have accumulated over decades of neglect. Most tellingly, an electrical conduit ran directly into the tunnel, hinting at modern lighting and possibly other advanced equipment installed deep inside. My initial assumption was that local authorities, or perhaps even the previous mining company, had been conducting their own safety inspections or environmental assessments. However, when I cross-referenced my records and contacted the company that originally operated the mine, I was met with a stark realization: no one had been authorized to access that specific site in over 20 years. The local sheriff's department also had no record of any recent activity in the area. This presented me with a profound dilemma. As a professional geologist conducting an official survey, I was duty-bound to document and assess all existing mine infrastructure. But if someone was using this particular mine for unauthorized, clandestine purposes, I might very well be walking into a dangerous, unforeseen situation. After considerable internal debate, I concluded that my scientific curiosity and my professional obligations outweighed my personal safety concerns. I meticulously equipped myself with all the standard safety gear for underground exploration: a robust hard hat with a mounted light, backup flashlights, a portable air quality monitor, an emergency beacon, and enough water and emergency supplies to sustain me for several hours underground. I also made sure to bring my digital camera and measuring equipment, determined to document whatever I found inside. The electrical conduit extended about 200 feet into the tunnel before connecting to a series of professionally installed work lights along the ceiling. It was immediately clear someone had invested significant time and money into making this abandoned mine not just accessible but fully functional. The tunnel itself was in remarkably good condition, with timber supports that appeared to have been recently reinforced, and a floor that had been cleared and leveled with meticulous care. As I ventured deeper into the mine, following the electrical conduit and the unwavering line of work lights, I began to notice side passages branching off from the main tunnel. These seemed to be original mining corridors, but several had been modified with new metal doors that looked utterly out of place in an abandoned coal mine. The doors were heavy steel constructions, fortified with multiple locking mechanisms, more akin to what you might find in a high-security facility than in a forgotten industrial mine. My air quality monitor reassuringly registered normal oxygen levels and no dangerous gases. So, albeit with growing apprehension, I continued deeper into the labyrinthine tunnel system. Roughly half a mile from the entrance, I reached what appeared to be the main excavation area, the very heart where the original coal extraction had taken place. But instead of the empty, echoing cavern I had expected, I found a sophisticated underground facility, expertly constructed within the natural mining chambers. Multiple rooms had been precisely carved out of the solid rock walls and fitted with an array of modern amenities: electric lighting, advanced ventilation systems, running water, and what chillingly appeared to be laboratory equipment. The construction was undeniably professional quality, clearly the work of experienced contractors with access to highly specialized underground construction techniques. This was no amateur operation, hastily assembled by local criminals or illicit drug manufacturers. In the largest of these underground rooms, I discovered something that rendered my entire scientific training utterly irrelevant, that shook the very foundations of my reality. Along one wall stood dozens of metal filing cabinets, brimming with documents, photographs, and what seemed to be medical records. The documents dated back to the 1940s and continued chillingly up to within the past few months. They meticulously detailed a long-term research project that had been conducted in this very location for over 70 years. The photographs were, without a doubt, the most disturbing part. They depicted people of various ages, from young children to elderly adults, all appearing to be subjects in some unfathomable medical or psychological experiments. Many of the subjects exhibited obvious signs of physical distress, severe malnutrition, and what horrifyingly looked like surgical procedures performed without any proper medical care. The more recent photographs were in color, depicting with terrifying clarity details of procedures that violated every single ethical standard of human medical research. According to the meticulously kept documents, the research project had been initiated in the 1940s, ostensibly as part of a government program to study the effects of isolation, sensory deprivation, and various experimental drugs on human subjects. The original funding, it seemed, had come from federal agencies, but by the 1960s, the project had apparently been transferred to private contractors who continued the research without any official oversight or approval. The subjects appeared to be people who wouldn't be missed by the outside world: homeless individuals, runaway teenagers, and people with mental illness who had been tragically institutionalized. Many of the files indicated that subjects had been deceptively told they were participating in legitimate medical studies or job training programs. But once they arrived at the facility, they had been held against their will and subjected to procedures that could only be described as systematic torture. The most recent files tragically indicated that the project was still horrifyingly active, and that new subjects were being brought to the facility regularly. There were chillingly detailed records of how subjects were recruited, transported to the mine, and processed through various experimental protocols. Many of the recent entries mentioned subjects who had been acquired from hiking trails, campgrounds, and other outdoor recreation areas throughout the Appalachian region. It was then that the full, dreadful realization crashed over me. I had stumbled onto undeniable evidence of a decades-long criminal conspiracy involving kidnapping, unimaginable human experimentation, and very likely murder on a massive, horrific scale. I immediately began photographing as many documents as possible, desperately attempting to create a comprehensive record of my discovery before reporting it to law enforcement authorities. That's when I heard voices, faint at first, emanating from one of the side passages. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly switched off my headlamp and crouched low behind one of the filing cabinets, striving to remain as absolutely silent as possible while the voices grew terrifyingly closer. There were at least 3 people, and they were discussing schedules and procedures with the chillingly clinical, professional manner of individuals entirely comfortable with their heinous actions. One mentioned needing to prepare for a new arrival who would be brought to the facility later that very evening. They discussed which experimental protocol would be most appropriate for this particular subject and debated the optimal dosage levels for the drugs they planned to administer. They spoke about human beings as if they were mere laboratory animals, with no acknowledgement whatsoever that they were planning to torture and likely kill another person. The voices were coming from a passage that led even deeper into the mine, towards areas I had not yet explored. I realized with a sickening jolt that there were probably additional rooms and facilities beyond what I had already discovered, and that current victims might be held in those dark, hidden areas right now. I was faced with an impossible, agonizing choice. The rational, logical thing to do would be to leave the mine immediately, drive to the nearest town with cell phone coverage, and contact federal law enforcement agencies about my discovery. But if people were being held captive in the deeper parts of the mine, they might be moved or killed before authorities could organize a rescue operation. My conscience screamed. I decided, with a desperate resolve, to try to gather more information about the current situation before leaving to contact law enforcement. I waited, holding my breath until the voices faded into the oppressive silence, then carefully, painstakingly, made my way toward the passage where I had heard them talking. The electrical conduit, a beacon of modern evil, continued in that direction, strongly suggesting there were indeed additional facilities deeper in the mine. What I found in those deeper chambers was worse than anything I could have possibly imagined. There were holding cells, barren and cruel, containing people in various states of profound physical and psychological distress. Some appeared to be heavily drugged or sedated, their eyes vacant. Others were conscious, but their emaciated bodies and terror-stricken faces showed undeniable signs of prolonged abuse and malnutrition. All of them had identification numbers tattooed crudely on their arms, as if they were mere inventory in some grotesque human warehouse. The individuals running this facility had transformed an abandoned coal mine into a sophisticated, clandestine underground prison where they could conduct illegal human experiments without any risk of discovery by outside authorities. They had been operating, unseen and unchecked, for decades, perfecting their methods and expanding their capabilities, all while remaining completely invisible to the outside world. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I had to document everything I could, and then get out of there immediately to contact law enforcement. But as I was frantically taking photographs of the holding cells, the chilling sound of footsteps echoed behind me. A cold dread enveloped me. I realized I had been discovered by whoever was running this nightmare facility. The next few minutes were the most terrifying of my entire life, a blur of pure panic, but somehow, by some miracle, I managed to escape from the mine and make it back to my vehicle. I drove straight, without stopping, to the FBI field office in Lexington and handed over all the photographs and documentation I had gathered. The federal investigation that followed led to the arrest of 12 people and the rescue of 17 victims who had been held in that horrific underground facility. But I know, deep in my soul, that what I uncovered was just one small, agonizing part of a much larger, insidious network of similar operations hidden throughout the remote, forgotten areas of the Appalachian Mountains. The memory of those tattooed arms, those vacant eyes, the muffled cries that I swear still echo in the silence of my home, they are etched permanently onto my being. My life as a geologist, once a pursuit of scientific truth and earthly wonders, has been irrevocably stained by the darkness I unearthed. I often find myself staring at maps, not seeing geological formations, but imagining other hidden entrances, other forgotten places where humanity's depravity might fester. The world feels different now, colder, more fragile. I carry the weight of those victims, both the rescued and the unknown, those who were never found, every single day. The FBI did their job, but the chilling realization that such evil can operate undetected for so long, right beneath our feet, leaves an unyielding grip on my heart. I know I'll never truly be free of those tunnels or the monstrous secrets they held. They became a part of me, a constant, silent reminder of the shadows that lurk just beyond the light. I had GPS, a satellite phone, all the modern gear a person could possibly need out in the wilderness. But none of it mattered, not one bit, when I stumbled upon something in those mountains that seemed to not only understand, but actively counteract every single piece of technology I carried. My name is Michael Chang, and I'm based out of San Francisco, California. For over 15 years, I've considered myself an expert in wilderness survival and backcountry navigation. I've dedicated countless hours to leading survival training courses, rigorously testing outdoor equipment, and plunging into some of North America's most remote and untamed wilderness areas. Yet what happened to me last fall in the mountains of eastern Tennessee shattered everything I thought I knew about modern survival. A major outdoor equipment manufacturer had hired me to field test their newest line of high-tech survival gear under the most extreme wilderness conditions imaginable. My kit was state-of-the-art, a military-grade GPS unit with satellite connectivity, an emergency beacon boasting global positioning, a thermal imaging scope, night vision goggles, and a satellite communication device capable of maintaining contact with civilization from literally anywhere on Earth. My mission was simple: spend 2 weeks alone in the most isolated part of the Cherokee National Forest, pushing each piece of equipment to its limits and meticulously documenting its performance for potential military and civilian clients. I specifically chose an area over 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a grueling hike through incredibly rugged terrain, steep ridges, dense forest, and numerous stream crossings. My topographic maps and satellite imagery confirmed no established trails, no camping areas, and no recorded human activity in the region for decades. It was, I believed, the perfect crucible for advanced survival technology. The first 3 days unfolded exactly as I'd planned. I set up my base camp in a natural clearing, conveniently located near a reliable water source. I spent my time testing the GPS, the communication equipment, and diligently documenting the performance of various survival tools. Everything worked flawlessly. I was genuinely impressed by how effortlessly modern technology streamlined wilderness survival compared to traditional methods. My GPS unit offered pinpoint location data, displaying detailed topographic maps on a crisp, high-resolution screen. The satellite phone maintained crystal-clear communication with my support team back in California, allowing me to transmit daily status reports and equipment evaluations. With the thermal imaging and night vision gear, I could navigate and even hunt effectively in complete darkness. I felt utterly in command of my surroundings, confident I could handle any emergency. That unshakable confidence evaporated on the fourth night. I woke up abruptly to find that every single piece of electronic equipment had died, simultaneously. My GPS unit was completely inert, its display dark despite showing a full battery charge just before I'd gone to sleep. The satellite phone wouldn't power on, and when I tried the old trick of removing and reinserting the battery, it flashed error messages I'd never seen in any manual. The thermal scope and night vision goggles were similarly useless, showing only static or completely black screens. My immediate thought was electromagnetic interference, perhaps a solar storm or military exercises nearby. But then I checked my backup gear, mechanical devices like my compass and altimeter, and discovered they were also malfunctioning in ways that defied all scientific logic. The compass needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any consistent direction. The altimeter readings fluctuated by thousands of feet within minutes, even though I hadn't changed my elevation. Even my trusty mechanical wristwatch had stopped, frozen at 3:17 a.m., precisely when I first noticed the failures. I spent the entire morning desperately trying to troubleshoot, meticulously checking batteries, connections, and settings according to manufacturer instructions. Nothing I tried worked. It was as if something was actively interfering with both electronic and mechanical devices, employing methods far beyond any natural phenomenon I could identify. Without GPS or communication, I was effectively stranded in one of the most remote parts of the eastern United States. But I'd faced similar situations before, relying solely on traditional survival skills, and I still felt a flicker of confidence that I could navigate back to civilization using natural landmarks and basic orienteering. That confidence quickly crumbled when I realized the very landscape around me seemed to be shifting. The clearing where my base camp stood and the stream I used for water were still there, but the surrounding terrain looked subtly different from my initial scout. Hills and ridges I had painstakingly marked on my maps were no longer in their correct positions relative to my campsite. The stream flowed in a direction I didn't recognize, and several distinctive rock formations I'd used as navigational beacons had either moved or vanished entirely. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was simply disoriented by the stress of all my equipment failing. But when I climbed to the highest point nearby for a better view, I could see that the entire landscape was subtly, yet definitively, different from what my maps indicated. Even more disturbing was the growing certainty that I was being watched. It started as an unsettling feeling, the prickle of being observed from the dense forest around me. As the day wore on, I began catching fleeting glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, always just at the edge of my sight, always vanishing the instant I turned to look. By evening, I was absolutely convinced that something was stalking me, deliberately staying hidden while monitoring my every move. Whatever it was, it moved through the forest with uncanny silence, never disturbing the undergrowth or making a sound that would betray its presence. That night, despite their previous failures, I decided to try my night vision equipment, hoping to finally identify my stalker. But when I powered on the goggles, instead of the familiar green-tinted view of the forest, I saw something that defied all explanation. The landscape appeared normal through the device, yet there were additional elements, invisible to the naked eye. I could discern what seemed to be structures within the forest, geometric patterns and artificial constructions that occupied the same physical space as trees and rocks, yet were somehow separate from the natural environment. Even more unsettling were the figures. At least a dozen humanoid shapes moved through the forest around my campsite, but they weren't quite human. They were too tall, too thin, and their movements suggested joints and limbs that didn't conform to normal anatomy. When I pulled the goggles off and looked at the same areas with my bare eyes, I saw only the normal, familiar forest. But the moment I put the goggles back on, the strange structures and figures reappeared, existing in some spectrum of reality, only visible through the modified electronics of the night vision system. It hit me then. My high-tech equipment hadn't simply malfunctioned due to interference or mechanical failure. Something had deliberately modified these devices, turning them into interfaces to show me things that existed alongside our normal physical world, but were usually hidden from human perception. The entities stalking me weren't just observing. They were manipulating my gear to demonstrate their technological prowess and communicate that they were far more advanced than anything humanity had ever conceived. Over the next few days, this manipulation grew more sophisticated and unmistakably intentional. My GPS unit began displaying locations that weren't on any earthly map, showing coordinates that placed me on other continents, even other planets. My satellite phone received calls from numbers with far too many digits, transmitting voices speaking in languages that sounded utterly inhuman. Most unsettling was when the thermal imaging scope started revealing the heat signatures of these entities. They appeared not as the familiar human or animal heat patterns I knew, but as complex, constantly shifting geometric designs, suggesting they existed in dimensions or states of matter our technology could only partially detect. I tried to leave the area multiple times, but each attempt only led to further disorientation and becoming even more hopelessly lost. The terrain continued to shift around me, familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing without any comprehensible pattern. My compass and GPS continued to provide contradictory information, sometimes indicating I was walking in circles, other times suggesting I was traveling in directions that didn't exist on any normal topographic map. After a week trapped in this impossible landscape, I finally encountered one of the entities directly. It approached my campsite just before dawn, moving with the same fluid, silent motion I'd observed through the night vision goggles. Up close, it was undeniably not human, though it maintained a roughly humanoid form. It stood over 7 feet tall, its proportions subtly, disturbingly wrong in ways that made it difficult to look at directly. The entity didn't speak in any language I understood, yet it communicated clearly. It conveyed that I was undergoing a test, a determination of humanity's readiness for contact with technologies and forms of existence far beyond our current understanding. My modern survival equipment, it indicated, had been specifically modified to serve as interfaces for this testing, allowing these beings to observe how I would react to phenomena that directly challenged my fundamenta. Growing up, my Appalachian grandmother spun tales that I always dismissed as mere mountain folklore. That is, until I encountered the chilling truth firsthand. My name is Kevin O'Brien, and I hail from the vibrant streets of New Orleans, Louisiana. What transpired in the mountains of Southwest Virginia 2 years ago proved beyond a doubt that some old legends are rooted in a truly terrifying reality. My grandmother, Mima Sarah, had spent her childhood in those very mountains before moving south in the 1950s. She often recounted stories of something she called the Fiddle Man, a mysterious entity whose music could, she claimed, drive people to madness. According to Mima Sarah, the Fiddle Man was an ancient spirit who had roamed the mountain hollows long before white settlers ever set foot in the region. He materialized as a tall, impossibly thin figure, dressed in clothes long out of fashion, always clutching a fiddle fashioned from materials utterly alien to any earthly craftsman. She insisted his music was the most beautiful and haunting sound anyone could ever hear, but that to listen for too long would surely steal your mind. You'd be left to wander the mountains forever, drawn deeper and deeper into places where no human should ever go, forever following that enchanting melody. She even told me about her own grandfather's encounter with the Fiddle Man in 1923. He had been hunting, alone in the woods near their family homestead, when he followed the sound of fiddle music for hours, completely losing himself in the wilderness. He only regained his senses just before dawn, realizing with a jolt that he had no idea where he was or how he had gotten there. It took him 2 agonizing days to find his way back home. For the rest of his life, he'd occasionally pause, tilting his head as if catching a whisper of distant music no one else could hear. I had always assumed these were just colorful family stories, the kind of folklore that flourishes in isolated mountain communities, offering entertainment during long winter nights. But when Mima Sarah passed away last year, she bequeathed me her old family homestead in the mountains of Virginia. With it came a letter, a stark warning never to stay there alone after dark, especially during the months when the mountain laurel was in bloom. As a music producer primarily working with traditional American folk music, the idea of owning property in the heart of Appalachian musical culture was incredibly appealing. I decided to spend a long weekend at the homestead, partly to assess its condition, and partly to see if I could record some authentic mountain music in the very area where my family had lived for generations. The homestead nestled deep in a narrow hollow called Devil's Backbone, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The original log cabin, built in the 1880s, had been expanded several times over the decades, but it had stood vacant for nearly 20 years and clearly needed significant repairs. There was no electricity or running water, but a good well and a perfectly functional stone fireplace offered some comfort. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late May, precisely when the mountain laurel was in full, glorious bloom, painting spectacular displays of white and pink across the surrounding forest. I spent the day cleaning up the cabin and setting up my recording equipment, planning to spend the evening documenting the natural sounds of the mountains and perhaps interviewing some local residents about traditional music and folklore. As the sun began its descent, I built a cozy fire in the stone fireplace and settled in with my digital recording devices, eager to capture the ambient sounds of the mountain evening. I hoped for owls, night birds, and perhaps some of the melodic insects common in Appalachian forests during late spring. What I recorded instead was something I still cannot fully explain. It began around 10 o'clock that night as a faint melody, seeming to emanate from somewhere deeper in the hollow. At first I thought it might be a neighbor playing music on their porch, but the nearest house was over 2 miles away, and this sound was definitively coming from the uninhabited forest surrounding my grandmother's property. The melody was played on what sounded like a fiddle, yet it possessed qualities I had never heard in any traditional instrument. The tone was incredibly pure and resonant, with harmonics that seemed to linger in the air long after each note was played. It was hauntingly beautiful, unlike any mountain music I had ever encountered, and it seemed to blend perfectly with the natural sounds of the forest around it. I immediately began recording, convinced I had stumbled upon precisely the kind of authentic mountain music I had hoped to find. The melody was complex and sophisticated, clearly the work of a master musician who understood traditional Appalachian musical forms, yet was pushing them in directions that felt both ancient and completely original. As I listened more carefully, I began to recognize elements from ballads and fiddle tunes that my grandmother had sung to me as a child. But this musician was weaving them together in ways that created entirely new compositions, building musical narratives that seemed to tell stories about the history and legends of these mountains. The music continued for over an hour, and I found myself utterly absorbed, following the intricate melodies and variations. I forgot about everything else, simply sitting by the fire, listening and recording, feeling as though I was experiencing something magical and unprecedented in my career as a music producer. Then a chilling realization dawned on me. The music was drawing nearer. What had started as distant melodies from deep within the forest was now clearly being played much closer to the cabin. I could distinctly hear footsteps on the wooden porch, the slow, deliberate pace of someone walking back and forth while continuing to play. The fiddle music was now so clear and immediate that it seemed to be coming from right outside the front door. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, half expecting to meet a local musician who had heard my recording equipment and decided to share some traditional mountain music with a visitor. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, and I saw no sign of anyone in the clearing around the cabin. Yet the music persisted, now seeming to come from different directions, as if the musician was circling the property while playing. I followed the sound with my flashlight, attempting to catch sight of whoever was creating this incredible music. But I never saw another person. The melody began to change, growing more complex and demanding, with rapid passages that required extraordinary technical skill. But there was also something hypnotic about it, something that made it incredibly difficult to think about anything else while the music played. I found myself walking away from the cabin, following the sound deeper into the forest without consciously deciding to do so. I remembered my grandmother's stories about her grandfather following fiddle music through the woods until he became completely lost, and I forced myself to stop walking and turn back toward the cabin. But when I looked around, I realized I could no longer see the lights from the fireplace or even recall the direction I had come from. The music surrounded me now, seeming to come from every direction at once. The melody was building to some kind of crescendo, becoming more intense and overwhelming with each passing moment. I felt like I was losing my ability to think rationally, becoming utterly absorbed in the music to the point where nothing else seemed to matter. That's when I saw him. He stood about 30 feet away, partially hidden by the deep shadows between two ancient oak trees. He was tall and impossibly thin, wearing clothes that looked as if they might have been fashionable in the 1800s. A long black coat, dark trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in profound shadow. In his hands was a fiddle that seemed to gleam with its own ethereal light, even in the encroaching darkness of the forest. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was looking directly at me while he played. The music originated from his fiddle, but it sounded as if it were being amplified by the entire forest, resonating through the trees and rocks and creating harmonics no normal instrument could possibly produce. As I stared at him, transfixed by the impossible beauty of the music, he began to walk deeper into the forest, never stopping his playing and never taking his eyes off me. I felt an overwhelming, almost primal compulsion to follow him, to hear more of this incredible music and discover where it would lead. I took several steps towards him before a jolt of pure terror brought me back to my senses. I remembered my grandmother's warnings and, crucially, the recording equipment I had left running back at the cabin. With an enormous, agonizing effort, I forced myself to turn away from the fiddle man and run back toward the homestead, using my flashlight to navigate blindly through the dense forest while the music continued behind me, growing fainter but never completely fading away. I stumbled back into the cabin and immediately gathered my recording equipment, planning to leave the mountains that very night despite the pitch darkness and the treacherous mountain roads. As I frantically packed my gear, I decided to listen to some of what I had recorded earlier in the evening, hoping to calm my rattled nerves. What I heard chilled me to my very core. The digital recording contained over an hour of the most beautiful fiddle music I had ever encountered. But there was something else in the audio that I hadn't noticed while it was happening. Underneath the captivating melody, barely audible, were human voices, dozens of them, singing,